4 years on, France remembers the terror attacks of 2015. 131 people killed and hundreds more hurt at bars, restaurants, and the Bataclan concert hall. Our senior reporter Chris Moore is covering the many ceremonies in the French capital today. On board with the Libyan Coast Guard. Coming up, our exclusive report on how migrants are being taken from their attempted sea crossings to Europe and are crammed into detention centers in Libya, a country already torn apart by war. And the world set to get its first taste of inside the Trump impeachment investigation. 2 top-level diplomats testifying today on live TV. I'm Jeannie Godula in Paris. This is our continuing coverage of the commemoration ceremonies of the November 13th, 2015 terror attacks. On that night 4 years ago, a group of 9 armed men stormed a series of sites, both in the northern suburb of Saint-Denis and then throughout the heart of Paris. By the end of the night, 131 people were killed. Over 400 were hurt. Well, the day is being marked today in Paris with a series of different ceremonies that are attended by the Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo, the Interior Minister Christophe Castaner, and several other government ministers. France 24's Chris Moore is following those ceremonies as well today. He joins us now live from the Bataclan concert hall, which suffered the worst of the violence on that night 4 years ago. Chris, talk us through the ceremonies today.
That's right. Well, as you said, the majority of people dead in that series of attacks back on November the 13th, 2015, losing their lives during that lengthy siege here at the Bataclan Theatre. And Mayor Hidalgo and the Interior Minister Christophe Castaner are due here very shortly, alongside victims, relatives, and a lot of survivors speaking out in recent days, saying how important they feel it is 4 years down the line to come and remember together. As you said, ceremonies have been taking place across the French capital. The first attacks on that night were suicide blasts at the Stade de France. The Paris Mayor and the Interior Minister began their day there, and also visiting all of these venues throughout eastern Paris, these cafes and bars which form part of the attackers' rampage. They'll be finishing up a little bit later on at the town hall of the 11th arrondissement, which saw more than its fair share of tragedy that year getting underway with the Charlie Hebdo attack.
Chris, for so many people, that night was such a turning point in so many ways. 4 years on, do you think, like the city itself, like France itself, has recovered from those attacks?
Well, obviously, in terms of those directly affected, those are lives that are going to take years to rebuild. But I think, in common with other major cities around the world that have seen terrorist attacks, daily life gets back to normal pretty quickly in places like Paris. In terms of France, the country, well, some of the more apocalyptic predictions that were being made back at the time about revenge attacks against Muslims, intercommunal fighting, etc., well, they've largely failed to manifest themselves, not detracting from the seriousness of the likes of that attack on a mosque down in Bayonne a couple of months ago. But in terms of the wider effect on society, there are these debates which are constantly kind of bubbling under the surface and which rear their heads pretty often about France's particular brand of laïcité, secularism, and then a seemingly infinite debate about the Muslim headscarf, for example, which has again come back into focus in recent weeks. As recently as this weekend, there was a march against Islamophobia. Even that proved controversial. Some of the French political left, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, went there. Others said, well, we're not going to march alongside people who we think are in some cases pretty unsavoury characters with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. Obviously, the political context in the background is the fact that Marine Le Pen's far-right political party continues to do well in the polls.
Of course, that political context is very prevalent in today's world, but today particularly, of course, we're focusing on the events of that night 4 years ago. Much of the violence, as we were saying before, happened there at the Bataclan. Many of us at France 24, of course, were working that night, experienced that live here as it was happening, as did you, Chris. You actually went out to the Bataclan just as those events were getting underway. Talk to us about your memories of that night.
Well, as I said, a lot of these series of attacks taking place in a part of Paris which has fairly active nightlife on a Friday night, as it was. Now the events at the Carillon started to come in on Twitter. Reports of shootings across the 11th arrondissement. These individual shootings actually didn't last that long. The Bataclan did last a lot longer. I remember coming down here relatively late at night. Obviously, the whole area was cordoned off by police. It was a lengthy siege. When they did eventually start bussing out some of the survivors around about, I think, 4 or 5 in the morning, well, the look on their faces is something which I'm never going to forget. In terms of the impact it's had on this part of the city, well, as I said, this was an arrondissement, a city in shock in the immediate aftermath. But in terms of life getting back to normal, well, these places like Paris are pretty resilient.
And Chris, just remind us again, as we look at the Bataclan there behind you, the concert venue has opened again. Tell us a bit about if people can go to the Bataclan today now, forgetting those events, or if they will be forever present in people's minds.
I think it was a very conscious decision made by the venue's management to get the venue up and running again as soon as possible. It's kind of a focal part of the community, and here many legendary gigs have taken place there over the years. Obviously, there was a temptation for the management to shut it down, to attempt to move on in other ways. But that concert, which I think it was eventually Sting who played reopening the Bataclan, that was something which many people who live in this part of Paris and further afield felt that they needed to come to as a sign of drawing some kind of line under what had happened.
Chris, thank you for that. France 24's Chris Moore, who's there at the Bataclan, where the next part of those commemoration ceremonies will be taking place shortly. There again, there will be a minute of silence, a laying of a wreath, and the reading out of the names. Of course, tragically, there at the Bataclan, close to 90 people were killed. You can see those live images from people there gathering, waiting just for the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, the interior minister, Christophe Castaner, making their way on foot from one site to the next as they all were located in close proximity. As we're waiting for that ceremony to get underway, I'm going to bring in our French politics editor, Mark Proman, who's here with us as well. Mark, they're going to be reading out the names of the victims. Just a word, if you can, about what's been done for the victims' families, for those who were wounded since the attacks 4 years ago.
Well, clearly, these attacks were a big shock for the country, for the president at the time, François Hollande, and for the government. We're seeing images of the man who was the interior minister, the key person, Bernard Cazeneuve, at the time, and he's there as well. But of course, essentially for the victims. So the state is helping them. There are structures that have been set up in the past to try to take care as much as feasible for a government for the victims. But there are also associations that were created to really say, okay, we need to take care of ourselves, talk about this, and because France has seen its fair share of attacks. And so there are essentially psychological help structures to try to help them talk about this and cope with this and try to look ahead. But of course, it's extremely difficult, and the sheer number of attacks in recent years has made this even more difficult. I mean, there was just a foundation that looked at the statistics, and between 2013 and August of 2019, they counted 42 terrorist attacks, 272 people killed. And those are the dead people. The wounded are even more, the families. So it's a big number that you have to deal with. And we've seen some cases where people couldn't go on and took their own lives. Thanks God it was only an exception, but we've seen this happen because no one is able to really know how to rebuild one's life after such an event. The state is helping, but it's more the family and also those small associations that are really tending to the victims as much as they can.
And I think as well, that's also the importance of ceremonies like today, 4 years on, where we're reading out the names of some of those 89 victims killed at the Bataclan. You can see their names written there on that plaque. Let's listen in.
Grégoire et Frédéric Hénineau.
Anne Guillaumard, née Cornet, et Pierre-Yves Guillaumard.
Stéphane H.
Olivier Auducœur,
Pierre-Antoine Henry. Mathieu Hoche.
Pierre Innocenti, Nathalie Jardin, Marion Jouanneau, Jean-Jacques Kirchheim,
Nathalie Lorraine, née Bouligina. Renaud Le Guen.
Gilles Leclerc, Christophe Lelouch, Claire Métro-Taprest,
Cécile Martin. Antoine Marie. Cédric Mauduit.
Isabelle Merlin, Fanny Minot,
Yannick Mainviel. Cécile Miss et Louis Felipe Choré.
Marie Mosser,
Quentin Mourier.
Christophe Mutez,
Hélène Muyal-Léris. Romain Naufle. Bertrand Navaret.
Christopher Neué-Schalter-Bodino, Lola Ouzounian, David Perchirin,
Aurélie de Peretti. Manuel Manu Pérez et Priscilla Correa.
Franck Pitiot, Caroline Prénat,
François-Xavier Prévost.
Richard Raman, Valentin Ribé,
Mathieu de Rortet. Estelle Roy. Thibaut Rousse-Lacordaire.
Raphaël Ruiz, Madeleine Sadin, Lola Saline,
Hugo Sarad. Jalal Seba.
Maude Serrault, Sven Alejandro Silva Perugini,
Valéria Solésine. Fabien Spech. Ariane Teller.
Éric Thomé, Olivier Bernadal.
Il va maintenant être procédé au dépôt de gerbes. Dépôt de gerbes des associations 13 11 15 Fraternité et Vérité et Life for Paris 13 novembre 2015.
And as they're getting ready to lay that wreath of flowers there at the Bataclan, we're just going to explain a bit about what you just heard moments ago, the names of the 89 people who were killed there at the Bataclan on November 13th that were read out, names that are also all written there on that plaque that sits in front of that concert venue now. 89 people just in that one place among the 131 who were killed on that night. So many people here in Paris were affected by what happened there on that night. Of those names read out, so many Parisians knew of someone who was there at that night. Even all of us here at France 24 lost a colleague, Mathieu Hoche, as well on that awful night. Mark Perlman also with us here now on set, our France 24 politics editor. Talk to us about the importance of this kind of ceremony, the importance of the presence of Mayor Anne Hidalgo and the other ministers there today.
Well, it's clearly to show the unity of the nation because, first of all, they're not from the same political party. Anne Hidalgo is the socialist mayor of Paris. Christophe Castaner and Nicole Belloubet are, of course, of the government of Emmanuel Macron. But clearly, this is to show that this was something that hurt France, whatever your political colors might be. And it's important for the victim to see that the city is here, that the government is there. The French president is not there. He tweeted some 50 minutes ago and saying, let's remember where we were, what we were doing, and let's make sure that we keep our pledge to stay united and not let the others win, the others being the terrorists and their attempts not only to kill people, but to divide the French people. And so clearly this is a willingness to pay tribute to the victims. We saw those moments. There are always clearly steering moments when the names are read out. It was already the case for the Charlie Hebdo attack, but clearly you have 89 names, one after the other. For those who've lived in the States, this is a ceremony we see on 9/11 nearly every year, where even more names, many more names are read out one by one to make sure that they're not forgotten and that they're not considered as a group of 89 people, that a life was taken and each life is important. So yes, it's become a kind of routine in a way, but I think for the families, it's always important to see that they're not forgotten, that they're not alone, even if it's only once a year.
Indeed, and the importance, of course, as after any great tragedies, to never forget, to remember, and to try to prevent those kind of things from happening again. To talk a bit more about that with me now, let's bring in Yann Saint-Pierre, a counterterrorism consultant and the CEO at Modern Security Consulting. 4 years after the attacks, how high is the terror threat in France now?
It still remains very high. We saw recently in other European countries that there were thwarted attack attempts, plots, and not just from the religious extremists, but also from the far right, from the far left. And so definitely the same level it was 4 years ago, but it morphed slightly, which gives the impression that things have improved, but in fact it stays very high.
And concretely, I know measures were put in place to try and stop this kind of thing from happening again. Some would say controversial measures. First of all, specifically, talk us through some of those measures and why they're controversial.
Well, the first one, of course, is the state of emergency, which is very unique, but in my opinion, a very political maneuver. We saw it actually fostered more attacks than it probably prevented some. It was seen to be a deterrent. Hasn't really been the case. What it resulted into is an overburden or burdening the security forces, especially the military, who weren't necessarily ready for this. The others are of course, in relation to internet. What extremist content online, how do you take it out earlier? An extension of that was the call for Christchurch earlier this year, where it fit into what was done over the last 4 years. And especially those laws are seen as intrusive. They're the ones who, where the question of, are you guilty if you only plan? Or are you innocent until proven guilty? Or just for intent, you're already guilty? And I think a lot of the measures that were enacted over the last 4 years play with that question. And this is where the controversy lies. Mm.
Mark, would you like to weigh in on that?
Well, it's true that the state of emergency was seen as a way to give some reassurance to the public. People on that night, there was already Charlie Hebdo, were traumatized, essentially, were scared to take public transportation. I mean, there was really a trauma, and so the government had to give some very tangible signs. And the state of emergency, having the soldiers on the streets of France monitor some public places, was seen as a way to reassure. What has happened since is that many of the measures, especially searches without warrants and preventive arrests and so on, were essentially integrated into common law. And so we don't really have a state of emergency anymore. However, many of the measures, especially the possibility for the police to really listen in on people's conversations without a warrant necessarily, are now part of common law. And it's true that since this very coordinated attack exactly 4 years ago, what we've seen is mostly kind of isolated attacks. I don't want to use the word lone wolf because a lone wolf is never totally lonely, and we've seen this again and again. But one can think of the most recent attack, and it was a big trauma here in France because it was within the headquarters of the French police. But how was it carried out? An employee went out and bought a knife and went on a rampage. So this is very different from a coordinated action with bombs detonated at the stadium outside of Paris, and then a whole team essentially going on a rampage in cafes, bars, and at the Bataclan. So in a way, you could say that the fight against terrorism and has probably helped. French officials have said repeatedly that this November 13 attack was planned in Raqqa, which was the then headquarters, quote-unquote, of the Organization of the Islamic State in Syria. The city was razed by the coalition forces. So yes, there's probably less organization and maybe less coordinated attempts, and probably better prevention, better intelligence to prevent this from happening. But as was rightly pointed out, the threat is still out. It has maybe changed. It's more about individuals taking things into their own hand, looking at things on the internet, and then doing something, and then the Islamic State saying, okay, this was us. But clearly, people have moved on, but are still under this threat of terrorism in their daily lives in Paris and other Western capitals, and of course in other parts of the world.
But given that there have been, the more recent attacks have been at police officials, soldiers, etc., Yann Saint-Pierre, a counterterrorism consultant, do you feel that perhaps that's given civilians a false sense of security in some strange way?
Not really. I alluded to earlier the spirit, the rambunctious and resilient spirit of Paris, where authorities, it's there, it's nice, but I think a lot more people were intimidated by the fact that soldiers were around carrying their weapons, wearing the flak jackets and so on, walking in fours or six in train stations. You're used to it when you get off at the airport because it's been part of the Vigipirate for 20 plus years. But when you see it everywhere, I think it had more of an intimidation factor rather than reassurance. And I think that's a very double-edged sword. I think it works for very short term, but in longer term, it doesn't work.
We were talking about this earlier, but just remind us again, because I know this is a question that comes up again and again for many civilians watching. What's the thing to do if you feel something's off? What can people do to stay safe?
Well, the awareness, again, because we're creatures of habit, we know what's going on in our areas, in our neighborhoods, and we know what's out of place. And I think having the courage and the awareness to go out and mention, well, that doesn't feel right, can you please pay attention to this? I think dismissing the idea that we could be laughed at or that where it could be a burden by saying this, I think we need to do away with that. I think another aspect which would be interesting is that we saw in recent attacks, whether it be in Australia or elsewhere, more and more citizens getting involved almost as first responders towards an attack. So it would be interesting, I think, to already provide in elementary school a basic for first aid intervention, because more and more citizens are getting involved. I'm not saying they should get involved in terms of going after the attacker, but being able to help out victims right away, that could be another way. So something that's within the limits of a citizen that is not trained for this, I think anybody can take a part in this.
It's an interesting proposition. Yann Saint-Pierre, thank you so much. Mark Pullman, thank you so much. We were talking, of course, about the Bataclan just a moment ago, that site, that concert venue that was so hit by tragedy, 89 people killed on November 13th, 4 years ago. Well, the Bataclan is trying to start again, struggling, though, to attract French artists to come and perform there. Let's take a closer look with Peter O'Brien.
A song about losing a friend resonates stronger here than most places. Singer-songwriter Jean-Louis Aubert performs on stage at the Bataclan. Music is trickling back to the venue, along with the crowds, despite all that happened here.
It's great that artists still come here and perform here. It must be hard for them.
We have to keep this place alive, if not they will have silenced it.
Jean-Louis Aubert chose to start his tour of the country here.
If we stop playing music here, it'll become a supermarket or a car park. That would be yet another very sad thing.
He's the exception. The Bataclan's director, who started the job a year ago, is struggling to attract French artists. The venue's had to adapt. It's been redesigned. Foreign artists make up 80% of its programme, and it's moved into other kinds of events, like dance shows and boxing.
As tragic as it is, we won't be put off by what happened 4 years ago. We're taking the spirit of the venue and making it stronger. We're overcoming today's challenges and looking to the future.
Currently, the Bataclan is losing money. It held 70 concerts last year, but needs twice as many to become profitable again, before it can guarantee a new chapter in its story.
We're going to step away from those commemorations of the attacks of November 13th to focus now on our exclusive series of reports this week from Libya. Today we'll take an exclusive look at the horrors suffered by thousands of migrants who are stuck in Libya trying at all cost to get to Europe. Human rights groups have denounced their treatment and the legality of forcing them to return to a conflict zone. Our reporters, led by Catherine Norris-Trent, managed to film some extremely rare pictures embedded with the Libyan Coast Guard and officials back on shore. They filmed Libyan police literally cramming migrants into buses, sending them to overcrowded detention centres. This is their exclusive report.
We're 130 kilometres from the Libyan coast and within 40 of Malta's search and rescue zone. The Libyan Coast Guard are responding to an alert from Malta and Italy, asking them to intercept a boat full of migrants heading for Europe.
Okay. Please, sit down.
126 people, including 8 children. They'd been at sea for 18 hours. At first, some believe they're being rescued by an NGO. They're crammed in with no food, water, life jackets or blankets. The migrants had risked it all to escape Libya.
But as the sun sets, they're being taken back to Tripoli, where they don't know what fate awaits them next.
The vast majority of those brought back today are from Sudan. The toll of their ordeal is clear. As we're filming, one of the migrants asked to speak to us without being identified, for fear of reprisals.
Je suis sûr, devant vous, ils vont dire n'importe quoi. Et après ça, il y a autre chose. On nous frappe, on nous fait de n'importe quoi. Ça fait 3 mois comme ça, j'étais en prison. Mais si tu manges, si tu ne manges pas, si tu meurs, si pas, c'est pas leur problème.
They wait on the dock for over 3 hours. The weakest treated for hypothermia by medics from the International Organization for Migration. The authorities are overwhelmed. We film secretly as Libyan officials try to work out what to do. We're told migrants here often throw themselves back into the water to try and escape. Finally, at 11:30 p.m., Libya's immigration brigades decide to take the men away to overcrowded detention centres. And tensions mount. A guard hides his gun. Our filming is clearly disturbing usual proceedings. Officially, there are a few thousand migrants in Libya's centres. But overall, the figure is way higher. There are thought to be nearly 1 million caught up in the chaos.
At least 12 Palestinians have been killed now from new clashes along the Israel-Gaza border. On Tuesday, an Israeli airstrike killed a top commander from the Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. That was followed by a day-long exchange of rockets into Israel and airstrikes into Gaza. Wasim Cornet has the latest.
Israeli tanks being moved toward the border with Gaza. In the distance, smoke from another airstrike. Just part of the show of force by the Israeli army a day after the worst cross-border fighting in months. It all began early on Tuesday when Israel launched an airstrike on Gaza, killing Baha Abu al-Atta, a top Islamic Jihad commander. Speaking with the Israeli army's chief of staff, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the man had been a threat to his country.
In the last year, this terrorist was the major terror attack generator in Gaza. He initiated, planned and executed many terrorist attacks and shot hundreds of rockets against the Israeli population around Gaza.
In Gaza, militants of the Islamic Jihad continued to fire rockets onto neighboring communities throughout the night on Tuesday. These pictures show several of them being intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system. The attacks come after a deadly day in the enclave, with Israeli airstrikes being blamed for the death of 10 people. The Israeli army said it had targeted Islamic Jihad militants as well as rocket-launching squads. The statement comes after a separate airstrike, this time in the Syrian capital of Damascus. The target, the home of another Islamic Jihad official. 2 people were killed, including one of his sons. So far, though, it is unclear whether the heightened tension will continue in the coming days. Although Hamas, which controls Gaza, joined the Islamic Jihad in condemning Israel for its actions, so far it has refrained from joining forces and launching rockets of its own.
And we're just hearing now that the death toll from the violence there has now gone up to 18 Palestinians killed. Angry protests erupted again last night following the first death in nearly a month of demonstrations in Lebanon. That death came after a speech by the president, Michel Aoun, that protesters said fell far short of their hopes for economic and political reform. Protesters have repeatedly called for an end to the current system and for technocrats to immediately replace seasoned politicians. And in the United States, the first public hearings in the impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump begin today. 2 seasoned diplomats will be testifying on TV, including William Taylor, the chargé d'affaires for Ukraine, and Foreign Service Officer George Kent. They're going to be grilled on whether Donald Trump pressured Ukraine to investigate Democratic presidential contender Joe Biden and his son. Peter O'Brien reports.
It's time to go public. Donald Trump's impeachment inquiry comes to television on Wednesday as witnesses begin to testify publicly on whether he pressured Ukraine to target his political rival, Joe Biden. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham says he won't be watching.
I think this whole thing is a sham. I took Mueller seriously. I don't take this seriously. I've read the transcript. I made up my mind. What they're doing in the House is unfair to the presidency as an institution. They're trying to drive his numbers down.
The inquiry was launched 6 weeks ago. House investigators have been conducting interviews behind closed doors with witnesses, including diplomats who've expressed concern about the White House's dealings with Kiev. Republicans are calling the process unfair. Some have defended Trump by saying he was trying to tackle corruption in Ukraine and get to the bottom of election meddling. But Adam Schiff, the Democrat leading the inquiry, said he would not let the hearings be derailed by such claims.
The House's impeachment inquiry and the committee will not serve as venues for any member to further the same sham investigations into the Bidens or into debunked conspiracies about the 2016 U.S. election interference.
Hearings are expected to move to the House Judiciary Committee by the end of the month, where formal charges against Trump, impeachment articles, are set to be drafted. After this, the president would be tried in the Senate, but thanks to its Republican majority, it's unlikely that he would be removed.
Officials in Bolivia say the death toll from the recent post-election unrest has now gone up to at least 7. The country's constitutional court has endorsed the deputy speaker of the Senate, who's proclaimed herself as interim president, filling that power vacuum created Sunday when the longtime president, Evo Morales, stepped down. Now, he slammed her promotion, calling it a nefarious coup. Thomas Waterhouse reports.
For now, at least, this is the woman taking the helm of Bolivia, a country she says is emerging from one of its darkest episodes. In front of a half-empty chamber, the deputy Senate leader, Janine Áñez, used a constitutional clause to take control of the assembly, meaning she was then able to elevate herself to the position of interim president. The benches where Evo Morales' leftist supporters normally sit lay bare, as many boycotted the session, meaning a quorum for the appointment wasn't reached. But with the endorsement of the Constitutional Court, Áñez donned the presidential sash to address crowds.
Thank you to all the Bolivian people. I'm going to work for you all, because Bolivians deserve to live in peace and never have their vote stolen again.
She's vowed to organise fresh elections as soon as possible, with a view to ending the civil unrest which has rocked Bolivia since Morales controversially won last month's presidential vote. But her new appointment appears to have done little to calm those tensions, with police clashing with pro-Morales supporters on the streets of La Paz. As for the man who abruptly stood down on Sunday, well, he's angrily tweeted from his new home in Mexico, where he's been granted political asylum.
The sneakiest and most nefarious coup in history has been completed. A coup-mongering right-wing senator has proclaimed herself president of the Senate and then interim president of Bolivia without a legislative quorum.
He's vowed to keep up his political fight and return home quickly, where hundreds of his followers continue to defend his presidency.
In Hong Kong, anti-government protesters paralyzed parts of the Asian financial hub for a third day, with some transport links, schools, and many businesses closing after an escalation of violence. Around 1,000 protesters blocked roads in the heart of the city's central business district during the lunchtime rush hour, wearing now banned face masks and dressed in office, where they marched and hurled bricks onto roads lined with some of the world's most expensive real estate and luxury flagship stores.
We had 5 demands, and now more have been added, like reforming the police force. Since the movement began, we've not succeeded. We'll not give up until justice is served.
I think we need to talk. We need to talk. Not like this. But hope for the future will stop suddenly, as soon as possible.
That wraps it up for the moment from the news desk. We'll be back soon with more of our continuing coverage of the commemoration ceremonies of this 4th anniversary of the terror attacks here in Paris. Earlier today, the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, the interior minister, Christophe Castaner, and other top officials were at the Bataclan, the site of one of the worst shootings there during those attacks 4 years ago. Close to 90 people were killed there at the Bataclan on November 13th, 2015. The majority of the 131 victims who were killed on that fateful night. There you can see those pictures of the laying of the wreath that was done at the Bataclan not long ago. Coming up soon will be a ceremony at the town hall of the 11th arrondissement in Paris. The 11th, of course, was the site of where most of those shootings took place 4 years ago. There will be concerts, there will be speeches from victims' associations, and we'll be bringing all of that live for you here on France 24 as soon as it starts. Stay with us.